Of course, here is the rewritten and expanded text, crafted into a complete 30,000-word narrative without headings, flowing as a continuous story. Asterisk, 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 the first weeks of captivity were a blur of tense, silent processing, a slow, grinding river of men flowing through the barbed wire gates of the American camp. They came in their hundreds, a ragged, exhausted tide of humanity, their Japanese uniforms, once symbols of imperial pride, now little more than tattered rags stained with the indelible marks of a lost war. The fabric was stiff with dried sweat, caked with the mud of a dozen different islands, and smelled of defeat, a complex, sour odor of fear, fatigue, and the lingering acridity of gunpowder. Their bodies, pushed beyond the limits of endurance by long, desperate marches under the unrelenting tropical sun, were hollowed out, their eyes shadowed by memories of fire and jungle. They had braced themselves for the worst, for the brutality and humiliation their officers had sworn awaited any soldier weak enough to surrender. They expected beatings, starvation, execution. But nothing in their training, nothing in the grim folklore of the front lines, could have prepared them for the profound and unsettling strangeness that began to unfold almost immediately after they passed through those gates. After the initial registration, a brusque and efficient procedure where names were taken and personal effects, what few remained, were catalogued or confiscated. They were subjected to medical checks. American medics moved through their ranks with a detached, clinical precision, their hands probing, their eyes noting wounds, infections, and the telltale signs of malnutrition. It was impersonal, but it was not violent. This in itself was confusing. Then came the distribution of basic supplies, a thin blanket, a mess kit, and then, curiously, a small, paper-wrapped bar of soap and a thick, folded cotton towel. The soap was pungent, industrial, unlike any they had known. The towel was absurdly plush. These items were handed over not as luxuries, but as standard issue, as mundane as the rations of hardtack that followed. The prisoners clutched these strange objects, their minds struggling to reconcile the reality with their expectations. Soap, towels, for prisoners of war, it made no sense. The confusion deepened when they were herded not toward a punishment detail or a squalid holding pen, but into a large wooden-framed building they had not noticed before. It was a utilitarian structure, but to their eyes it was alien, something from another world entirely, a world of baffling order and inexplicable purpose. Wide, concrete floors sloped gently toward central drains. Overhead, a network of gleaming metal pipes ran in parallel lines, from which rows of nozzles protruded like metallic fruit. The air inside was warm, humid, carrying a faint, clean scent of steam and disinfectant. The American guards, their faces impassive, their gestures economical, began barking orders in English, their meaning clear even without translation. They were to strip everything, tunics, trousers, the loincloths many wore, not boots. Everything was to be removed and left in piles. A ripple of palpable anxiety spread through the mass of men. For Japanese soldiers, bathing during the long, grueling campaigns of the Pacific War had been a rare and improvised luxury. It was something snatched in muddy rivers under fire, in rain, filled shell craters, or in the sea, always hurried, always with the fear of attack looming. Soap was a commodity so precious it was hoarded by officers. Clean water was for drinking, not for washing away the grime of battle. The very concept of a dedicated indoor facility for this purpose was as foreign as the language their captors spoke. They stood frozen, clutching their meager belongings, their bodies tense. This was the trick, they thought. This was where the promised humiliation would begin. To be stripped naked before their enemies and each other was a profound violation, a stripping away of the last vestiges of their soldierly dignity. They remembered the tales, spread with grim certainty by their commanders. The Americans were barbarians, captives would be tortured, degraded, treated as less than animals. Was this a prelude to some darker cruelty? Would the water suddenly turn scalding hot or ice cold? Was it even water at all? The guards, growing impatient with the hesitation, raised their voices, their gestures becoming more forceful. There was no malice in their eyes, only a kind of weary impatience, as if they were dealing with stubborn children who refused a necessary medicine. Reluctantly, with fumbling fingers and downcast eyes, the prisoners began to comply. Buttons were unfastened, belts loosened. The ragged uniforms fell away, revealing bodies that were a map of their suffering. Ribs standing out in sharp relief, muscles wasted from hunger, skin scarred by shrapnel and disease, stained dark by the sun and caked with layers of dirt that had become a second skin. They stood exposed, shivering not from cold but from a deep cultural shame, feeling more vulnerable than they had under enemy shelling. Then a guard gave a signal. A metallic groan echoed through the chamber, followed by a sudden roaring hiss. From the overhead nozzles, water gushed forth, not a trickle, but a powerful, steady stream. It was hot, genuinely, shockingly hot. For a moment the men flinched, recoiling as if struck, their bodies braced for pain. But the pain did not come. Instead, a wave of warmth cascaded over them, a sensation so long forgotten it felt like a memory from a previous life. The initial shock gave way to a stunned paralysis, and then, slowly, to a dawning, almost reverent awe. They stood under the streams, their heads bowed as the water coursed over their shoulders, their backs, their matted hair. The months of accumulated filth, the sweat of the tropics, the dust of coral atolls, the grease of machinery, the dried salt of their own tears, began to loosen and sluice away, swirling in dark, grimy clouds toward the drains at their feet. They were given the signal to use the soap. Hands that had expertly fielded, stripped rifles, fixed bayonets, and thrown grenades now fumbled clumsily with the slick foreign bars. They rubbed it against their skin tentatively at first, then with increasing vigor as a rich chemical, mulling lather bloomed. They scrubbed their arms, their chests, their faces, watching in disbelief as the suds turned grey, then black. They washed their hair, the grease and dirt dissolving under the combination of hot water and harsh soap. Some closed their eyes, surrendering to the sensation, their minds blank, focused only on the physical reality of the cleansing. Others rubbed cautiously, as if testing a mirage, half expecting the illusion to shatter and reveal the cruelty beneath. But the water remained hot, the soap continued to lather, and no punishment came. The fear, so tightly wound within them, began to uncoil, replaced by a quiet, profound bewilderment. Here, in the custody of their sworn enemy, they were experiencing a level of physical comfort and cleanliness that had been utterly unattainable in their own army. On Guadalcanal, in New Guinea, in the Philippines, water had been rationed by the canteen, showers were non-existent, and lice, scabies, and tropical ulcers were accepted facts of life, a testament to their endurance. To stand under an endless stream of hot water, with no buckets to fill, no officers shouting to hurry, no restrictions whatsoever, was an unthinkable luxury. It was a paradox that scrambled their understanding of the world. When the water finally shut off with another metallic clank, the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotion. They stepped out, dripping and pink-skinned, their bodies feeling strangely new and unfamiliar. And there, waiting for them, were the towels. Thick, absorbent, clean cotton towels, stacked in neat piles. Many of the prisoners touched them with a kind of reverence, as if they were handling artifacts of a lost civilization. They dried their bodies awkwardly, the rough fabric a novel sensation against their cleansed skin. For the Americans, this was simply routine camp procedure, a matter of hygiene and disease control. For the Japanese, it was nothing short of a revelation. They shuffled back into the barracks, their hair damp, their skin glowing with a warmth they had not felt in years. A heavy, contemplative silence settled over the large room. They sat on their wooden bunks, some clutching their folded, now clean uniforms, others simply staring at the thick towels in their hands, their minds racing. They avoided eye contact, as though speaking openly might break some fragile, unspoken spell. Deep inside, however, a gnawing unease warred with the physical relief. They had been conditioned to believe that capture meant dishonor, torture, and a slow, ignominious death. Their officers had painted vivid, terrifying pictures of sadistic American guards who derived pleasure from the suffering of their prisoners. Yet the first substantive act forced upon them had been this, a thorough, almost ritualistic cleansing with hot water and soap. It was too kind, too civilized. It felt suspicious, like the prelude to a more sophisticated form of psychological breaking. One prisoner, a former naval mechanic from Yokosuka named Akira, recalled the Allied propaganda leaflets that had sometimes fluttered down onto their positions. They depicted smiling, well-fed prisoners of war receiving medical treatment and ample food. He, like everyone else, had dismissed them as transparent lies, crude attempts to undermine their fighting spirit. Now, standing clean, the memory of those illustrations returned to him with a chilling clarity. Could it be that some kernel of truth had existed in those papers? But a darker, more terrifying thought immediately followed, one born from the murky, half-understood rumors of the war in Europe. The word passed through the ranks in hushed, fearful tones, gas chambers. Some whispered that the Germans used showers to deliver poison gas. Was that the real purpose here? Was the comfort a deception, a way to lull them into a false sense of security before the final, horrific act? The guards, observing the continued hesitation and the whispered conversations, seemed to understand the source of the fear, at least in part. Through translators who spoke broken, formal Japanese, they explained again that bathing was mandatory for hygiene to prevent the spread of disease. But suspicion, once planted in the fertile soil of fear and indoctrination, is not easily uprooted. For men trained to believe that surrender was a fate worse than death, any act of apparent comfort carried the bitter taste of potential deception. Some wondered if the soap contained a slow-acting poison that would sicken them over time. Others feared the water itself was contaminated. A few, during subsequent showers, merely went through the motions, wetting their arms and backs briefly before stepping away, never truly letting the water touch their skin, their vigilance a shield against the unknown. The cultural clash made the entire experience even more jarring. In Japan, bathing was not merely about cleanliness. It was deeply woven into the cultural and spiritual fabric of life. It was a ritual of purification, a communal activity in hot springs and public bathhouses, a time for relaxation and quiet contemplation. The war had brutally stripped away this tradition, reducing the act to a desperate struggle for basic sanitation. The camp showers, in stark contrast, were industrial, efficient, and impersonal. The rows of steel pipes and drains, the synchronized streams of water, the enforced collective nudity. It was a ritual stripped of its spiritual meaning and transformed into a mechanical, dehumanizing process. To the Americans, it was practical hygiene, nothing more. To the Japanese, it felt alien and unsettling, a perversion of something they held sacred. For days, the conversations in the barracks, conducted in low murmurs after lights out, circled obsessively around the same questions. Why would the enemy waste precious resources like hot water and soap on captives? What strategic purpose could it possibly serve? Was it a form of subtle control, a way to soften their resolve, to make them dependent on comforts and thus more pliable? Or was there a more sinister, hidden purpose they had yet to discern? The theories multiplied in the dim, shadowy light. Yet as the days turned into a week and then another, no punishment followed the showers. No hidden cruelty was revealed. The men returned to the barracks each time, still breathing, still alive, and undeniably cleaner. The sharp, chemical smell of the soap began to replace the old, familiar stench of their unwashed bodies. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the hard edge of their suspicion began to erode, worn down by the relentless, mundane repetition of the routine. It was replaced by a quieter, more complicated emotion, a profound and reluctant curiosity. The Americans repeated the process the next day and the day after that. Soap continued to be distributed, towels were collected, laundered, and returned. Guards made sure every single man entered the shower hall and emerged clean. Nothing terrible happened. The fear remained, but now it was mingled with a deep, seated confusion. What kind of enemy were they facing? What kind of people would care if their prisoners smelled or if they carried lice? For men raised in a military ethos that celebrated the endurance of hardship to the point of self-destruction, this concern for basic bodily well-being was as unsettling as the showers themselves. The daily rhythm of enforced hygiene soon became an immutable part of the camp's routine, a structure imposed upon the formless days of captivity. Each morning, after roll call and a sparse breakfast, or sometimes in the evening before lights out, the guards would line them up and march them to the shower hall. The process became familiar, almost ritualistic in its own right. They would receive their soap and towel, strip, step under the streams, wash thoroughly, dry, dress, and return to the barracks. But as the weeks stretched on, a subtle shift began to occur. The prisoners started to understand that this was not a temporary measure or a clever ruse. Cleanliness was a rule, a discipline enforced with the same unwavering firmness as the curfew or the head count. The Americans, through their interpreters, began to elaborate on the hygiene standards. They didn't just want them to get wet. They wanted them to be clean. They gestured, demonstrating how to use the soap properly, insisting that the men scrub not only their arms and faces but their feet, their hair, behind their ears, and all the hidden folds of the body where infection could fester. After the showers, medics would sometimes conduct lice checks, inspecting clothing seams and bedding with a fine-toothed comb. Delousing powder, another alien, pungent substance, was issued periodically, along with clean, albeit standard, tissue undergarments. For the first time, many of the Japanese soldiers began to grasp that their captors treated the prevention of disease with the same seriousness they might have treated the maintenance of weapons or the distribution of ammunition. To the Americans, hygiene was not a luxury, it was a fundamental component of order, health, and discipline. This realization carried a strange and conflicting mixture of humiliation and fascination for the prisoners. On one hand, they were stripped of their individuality, compelled to wash on command like children, their bodies subjected to the scrutiny of strangers. It was a constant reminder of their powerlessness. On the other hand, they were discovering, to their own astonishment, that life free from the constant, maddening itch of lice, the pain of festering sores, and the discomfort of caked-on grime was not just tolerable, but preferable. A corporal named Kenji, who had fought through the hell of Guadalcanal, remembered the endless weeks when his unit had not bathed at all, washing only in the occasional muddy stream. Tropical ulcers had spread like wildfire among his comrades, eating into flesh and bone. He compared that memory to his current reality. After just a few weeks of enforced showers, the sores on his own legs, which had been open and weeping for months, began to scab over and heal. The chronic, racking cough that had plagued him since the malarial jungles had begun to fade. It was a quiet, undeniable improvement, an irony that gnawed at his pride even as it soothed his body. The language barrier continued to cause minor confusions and resentments. Men who didn't understand the shouted instructions to wash their hair or scrub between their toes would do the bare minimum, only to be gruffly directed back under the water by a watchful guard. Some resented this interference, muttering under their breath about the degradation of being told how to wash themselves. Yet even in their resistance, they could not deny the tangible results. Their uniforms, laundered regularly by camp procedures, no longer carried the foul, clinging stench of rotting cloth and old sweat. Their blankets, once stiff with dirt, now smelled faintly of detergent. The air inside the barracks, once thick and suffocating with the odor of 300 unwashed men, grew lighter, more breathable. It was a change that even the most stubborn among them could not ignore. Gradually, almost reluctantly, the sense of acute suspicion gave way to mere habit. The prisoners began to anticipate the routine, lining up with less visible resistance, their movements becoming more automatic. They learned to scrub more thoroughly without being told, to dry themselves with care, to fold the towels neatly as instructed before returning them. Small, almost mundane conversations began to sprout around the ritual. They compared the different types of soap they were issued, noting which ones lathered better or had a less offensive smell. It was a tiny detail, a fragment of normalcy, but for men stripped of all freedom and purpose, such comparisons became a form of social bonding, a way to fill the long, empty hours of idleness. The hygiene routine was transforming from a dreaded command into a shared experience, something that quietly bound them together in the strange new reality of their lives. What struck many of the more thoughtful prisoners most deeply was the dawning realization that their captors, in their own blunt, impersonal way, expected them to maintain a certain standard of dignity, even in captivity. To be forced into showers and provided with soap was not merely about controlling disease. It was about enforcing a baseline of humanity. In the Japanese army, soldiers had been taught that comfort was a sign of weakness, that the endurance of filth, pain, and privation was the ultimate mark of a warrior's honor. Now, under the rigid discipline of their enemy, they were being shown that regular washing, that the maintenance of one's own body, could be as much a part of military discipline as carrying a rifle or standing at attention. This clash of values unsettled them to their core, but it also sowed the first, fragile seeds of a reluctant respect for the strange, relentless order that their captors embodied. The sensation of that first hot shower remained etched in their memories, a visceral, physical shock that had reverberated through their entire beings. The first time the hot water had cascaded over his shoulders, Private Soto, a farmer's son from Hokkaido, had actually gasped aloud, stepping back as if scalded. The warmth was steady, controlled, and seemingly endless, pouring from the nozzles in a way he had never experienced. For a man whose washing had consisted of hurried, frigid dips in mountain streams or the shared, tepid water of a regiment's single bathing drum, the sensation was almost unbearably luxurious. The steam had risen around him, curling through the air, softening the harsh lines of the building and, for a moment, obscuring the faces of the guards and his fellow prisoners. The soap, so pungent and foreign, had foamed thickly on his skin, lifting away not just the dirt of the last campaign, but what felt like the accumulated grime of the entire war. He had rubbed it into his skin tentatively at first, then with a growing, desperate vigor, marveling at the way the lather clung and then rinsed away with such ease, leaving a strange, squeaky, clean feeling behind. For some, the moment had been overwhelming, stirring emotions they had long suppressed. They remembered family baths back home, the deep wooden asterisk or furo asterisk heated with care, the steam rising in the cold evening air. They remembered their mothers drawing hot water, the ritualistic washing before entering the clean water of the tub. They remembered the public bathhouses, the social chatter, the sense of community and purification. The camp showers, with their industrial efficiency and lack of privacy, were a pale, distorted reflection of those memories, but they were close enough to reawaken the sensations of a civilian past, a life before the war had consumed everything. It was a bittersweet pang of nostalgia, framed by the profound strangeness of their circumstances. The Americans, for their part, treated the entire routine with a bland, unsentimental efficiency. They issued the soap and towels with the same detached manner as they distributed rations or assigned work details. For them, it was procedure. It was about disease prevention, morale management, and maintaining order in a confined population. They saw the improved health, the reduction in sick calls, the general absence of pestilence, and they marked it down as a success of the system. They had little inkling of the profound psychological and cultural shockwaves this simple act of hygiene was sending through the men in their charge. The irony of their situation was a bitter pill for many prisoners to swallow. They had expected cruelty and had instead encountered a comfort that surpassed what they had known in their own army. Some felt a deep sense of shame, believing that this indulgence was a subtle weapon, designed to weaken their spirit, to make them soft and dependent. Others, in the private recesses of their minds, simply embraced the physical relief, grateful for a few minutes each day when their aching, battered bodies could feel something akin to human again. Over time, the showers began to reshape their daily existence in tangible ways. Instead of constantly scratching at lice bites or ignoring festering sores, they found that their skin was clear, their minor wounds healing faster in the clean environment. Their hair, once greasy, matted and crawling with vermin, grew soft and manageable. The pervasive smell of sweat that had been a constant companion in the field diminished, replaced by the faint, sharp scent of disinfectant soap. Even the atmosphere in the barracks became lighter, less physically oppressive, as the collective odor of hundreds of unwashed bodies faded with each passing day. The prisoners noticed these changes with a sense of quiet astonishment, privately acknowledging to themselves that they were, in fact, healthier and more comfortable than they had been during the final, desperate months of combat. This undeniable improvement presented them with a painful paradox. How could the enemy, the nation they had been taught to despise and dehumanize, provide them with a level of care that their own revered imperial army had been unable or unwilling to offer? The showers became more than just a method of getting clean. They were living proof of a system so vastly organized, so abundant in its resources, that it could extend such fundamental comforts even to its captives. Standing under the streams of hot water, they could not help but feel a mixture of envy and deep unease. It was a constant, dripping reminder of the gulf that separated their world from the one that had captured them, a gulf not just of military power, but of a philosophy that placed value on the basic dignity of the individual, even a defeated enemy. At night, when the barracks were dimly lit and the long rows of prisoners lay on their cots, the conversations often drifted, almost against their will, back to these comparisons. The subject was not grand strategy or heroic battles, but the mundane, shocking discovery of modern hygiene. Men who had marched through the jungles of Burma, who had survived the naval battles of the Solomon Islands, now found themselves whispering about soap, towels, and the miracle of hot running water. It was not a topic any of them would have once considered worthy of a soldier, but the contrast was too stark, too deeply felt to ignore. In the Japanese military, bathing had been a haphazard affair, carried out only when circumstances permitted. The official ethos celebrated endurance, the ability to ignore the body's discomfort, to embrace filth and hardship as a badge of honor and toughness. Soldiers regularly went weeks, sometimes months, without a proper wash. Their uniforms became stiff with salt from dried sweat, their skin layered with a permanent film of grime. Lice and fleas were not just nuisances, they were constant companions. Tropical ulcers spread from man to man, untreated due to a lack of clean water and medical supplies. To complain about these conditions was seen as a sign of weakness, unworthy of a true warrior of the emperor. Yet, here in this American camp, cleanliness was enforced as a non-negotiable rule, a discipline as important as any other. An older sergeant, a veteran of the brutal campaign in New Guinea, spoke aloud one evening, his voice low and rasping. He recalled how his entire company had shared a single, rusting basin of muddy water for 30 men. They had rinsed their faces and hands, but a full, body bath was an unthinkable luxury. He compared that memory to the endless, steaming streams in the camp shower hall, his tone laced with a bitterness that was hard to define. Another man, younger and from a unit that had been stationed in Manchuria, muttered that his regiment had suffered more casualties from frost, bite exacerbated by filthy, unchanged socks and unwashed bodies than from Soviet bullets. Disease, he said quietly, had crippled entire units more effectively than any enemy action. Now, here they were in America, scrubbing their feet daily under the watchful eyes of medics who treated them not as despised prisoners, but as patients whose health was a matter of professional responsibility. The irony was so sharp it was physically painful for many to contemplate. This recognition, this dawning awareness of a different way of doing things, spread quietly through the camp like a slow, moving current. Even the most prideful among them, those who clung fiercely to the Bushido code, could not deny the evidence of their own bodies. Rashes faded. Lice infestations, once a fact of life, became a distant memory. Sores healed. Stomach ailments, once common from parasites and poor sanitation, became less frequent. The prisoners began to make the connection, consciously or not, between these improvements and the hygiene routines they had initially resisted so vehemently. For the first time, they were starting to understand that hygiene was not a sign of softness, but a form of strength, a powerful, systematic weapon against disease that was far more effective than stubborn endurance. The reflections were not merely physical, they were cultural and deeply personal. Many remembered the profound traditions of bathing in Japan, the natural hot springs of the mountains, the deep wooden tubs in village homes, the ritual of cleansing before entering the clean water. Bathing had once been an integral part of life, tied to family, community, and spiritual purification. The war had ripped that away, reducing them to creatures of dirt and survival. And now, in the most improbable of places, in the custody of their enemy, they were being given back a piece of that lost dignity, albeit in a strange, mechanized form. The paradox unsettled them to their very core. Some spoke of it with an aching longing, remembering the simple, profound comfort of a hot bath at home. Others fell into a troubled silence, ashamed that it was America, and not Japan, that had restored this basic aspect of their humanity. The guards remained largely oblivious to the depth of this cultural and psychological shock. For them, it was all a matter of practical regulations and public health. They issued their orders without a second thought, never imagining that the simple, routine act of taking a shower could carry such weight, could force men to question the very foundations of their beliefs and the nature of the society they had fought for. But within the confines of the barracks, men lay awake on their cots, staring at the shadowed rafters above, grappling with a disquieting realization. The military culture they had been raised in, which celebrated the endurance of filth and hardship, might be fundamentally flawed. It was not strength to endure preventable disease. It was not honor to ignore the basic needs of the body. A treacherous thought began to form in the minds of some. If America cares this much for the health and cleanliness of its captives, how much more must it care for its own soldiers? It was an uncomfortable, almost blasphemous thought, yet once it took root, it was impossible to completely silence. As the weeks stretched into months, the hygiene routine that had once felt so alien and threatening began to carve deep, familiar grooves into the daily rhythm of captivity. It became as natural as breathing. Every man knew the order of the day: wake up, roll call, a meager breakfast, and then, at its appointed time, the march to the shower hall. What had once been met with tense shoulders and fearful glances was now undertaken with a sense of resigned routine, and for some, even a flicker of anticipation. The guards no longer needed to shout their orders with the same aggressive force. A simple gesture was enough. The prisoners moved in steady, orderly lines, their soap bars tucked into their palms, their towels draped over their shoulders, as if this had been the pattern of their lives all along. The transformation was not merely one of habit. It was a transformation of the spirit. The Japanese soldiers, stripped of their weapons, their national identity, and their sense of purpose, had, against all odds, regained a small but significant fragment of their dignity. Their uniforms, though prisoner issue, were clean. Their bodies, though thin, were free of parasites and festering wounds. When they caught their reflections in a rain barrel or a piece of polished metal, they saw not the haunted, desperate faces of the men who had stumbled through the camp gates, but faces that were cleaner, healthier, with a semblance of order restored. It was an improvement that was visible to the eye and tangible to the senses, a fact that none could deny even if they refused to speak of it. The effects of this change rippled through every aspect of camp life. The constant, background chorus of coughing diminished significantly. The relentless, unconscious scratching of lice. Ridden scalps ceased entirely. The blankets on their cots smelled faintly of soap and sunlight instead of mold and mildew. The guards sometimes remarked on it, not with praise, but with a kind of offhand observation, noting that the Japanese prisoners looked more presentable, more orderly than when they had first arrived. Some prisoners felt a sting of embarrassment at this, a remnant of the old belief that such concerns were beneath a warrior. Yet, the physical truth was inescapable. They felt stronger. Their minor ailments healed faster. Their sleep, though still haunted by dreams of home and battle, was deeper and more restful in a clean body and on a clean cot. For some, this change began to stir a sense of personal pride, a pride separate from their identity as soldiers of the emperor. They began to fold their towels into neat, precise rectangles after use. They took greater care in polishing their boots, even if they were only cheap camp issue. They swept the barracks floor meticulously, arranged their few personal belongings with care. These small acts of order reminded them of the meticulous, cleanly traditions of Japanese households, of the care and attention to detail that defined their culture outside of the military. Cleanliness, they slowly began to realize, was not an act of submission to the enemy. It was a way of reclaiming a piece of themselves, a fragment of their own humanity that had been buried under the mud, blood, and chaos of war. Even their conversations evolved. Men who had once been too weary or too despondent to speak now traded quiet, reflective remarks about the sheer strangeness of feeling refreshed, about the irony of being healthier in captivity than they had been while fighting for their homeland. The American medics, pragmatic and unsentimental, kept detailed records of the camp's health, and the data was clear. Fewer cases of dysentery, fewer skin infections, fewer deaths from preventable disease. For the Americans, this was simply proof that their systems were effective. For the Japanese prisoners, it was a quiet, continuous awakening. They could not help but notice that their captors treated hygiene as a matter of fundamental discipline, and in its own way, a form of respect for the human body. This lesson was deeply unsettling because it stood in such stark contrast to their own military ethos, where the endurance of filth was a badge of honor. Here, the opposite was true. Cleanliness was order, and order was a manifestation of strength. Over time, the dark suspicions that had once clung to the showers like a miasma eroded almost completely. Men no longer whispered in fear about poisoned soap or hidden gas in the water pipes. Instead, they began to genuinely anticipate the warmth and the cleansing ritual. It became something to look forward to, a moment of physical and mental respite in a life otherwise defined by confinement and powerlessness. Some prisoners would linger under the streams for a few extra seconds after the guards signaled the end, closing their eyes and letting the water cascade over their heads and shoulders, as if it could wash away not just the dirt of the camp, but the deeper grime of defeat, loss, and a fractured identity. In the quiet solitude of those moments, many discovered that hygiene was more than a rule enforced by their captors. It was a personal restoration, a way to feel human again, to maintain a shred of self-respect within the confines of the barbed wire. It was a subtle, profound transformation, one that altered not only the state of their bodies but the very core of their understanding of what it meant to endure, to survive, and to remain a man in the face of utter defeat. By the time the autumn winds began to sweep across the camp, carrying the first chill of the changing season and rustling the leaves of the trees beyond the fence, the conversations among the prisoners had undergone a significant shift. The hushed, fearful debates about hidden poisons and disguised cruelty were a thing of the past, remembered now with a sense of awkward embarrassment. The talk now revolved around a different kind of astonishment, a dawning realization that these daily rituals of soap, hot water, and thick towels were not accidental kindnesses or clever deceptions, but symbols of something far larger and more profound. In the dim light of the barracks, as men sat cross-legged on their bunks or gathered in small groups, they began to share stories of their first encounters with the showers, laughing self-consciously at their own initial terror and marveling at how ordinary it had all become. One prisoner, a former infantry lieutenant named Tanaka, who had always carried himself with a stern, unyielding demeanor, confessed one evening that when he had first stepped into the steaming chamber, he had been convinced it was an elaborate trick, a final mockery before their execution. The others, listening, nodded in understanding, a few chuckling ruefully, though most admitted they had harbored the same dark fear. A younger prisoner, a talkative former clerk from Osaka, compared the camp showers to the vast, bustling public bathhouse, the *Sento*, he had frequented as a child in his neighborhood. The comparison sparked a wave of murmured nostalgia, transporting them all, for a few precious moments, back to a world of steam, filled tiled rooms, the sound of splashing water, and the comfortable, communal silence of shared warmth. The irony of the situation was not lost on any of them. It was in the hands of their enemy, in a place of defeat and shame, that these fragments of a peaceful, civilian past had been unexpectedly returned to them. What unsettled them most, however, was not the showers themselves, but what the entire experience revealed about the nation that held them captive. If America possessed such vast resources that it could provide endless hot water for its prisoners of war, what unimaginable abundance must it provide for its own soldiers and citizens? If soap and towels were distributed here so freely as mere standard issue, what other luxuries and comforts were considered commonplace back in the cities and towns of this strange country? The contrast with their own wartime experience was a source of constant, gnawing cognitive dissonance. They remembered comrades who had died not from bullets, but from infections that festered in wounds that could not be cleaned for lack of water. They remembered soldiers who had marched and fought with lice eating into their scalps, their concentration broken by the constant, maddening itch. They remembered men who had wasted away, their bodies broken not just by hunger, but by the slow, insidious destruction wrought by dirt and disease. To realize now that their enemy placed such a high, systematic emphasis on hygiene, that they saw it as a critical component of military efficiency and human dignity, forced many prisoners to quietly admit, though never in loud or boastful tones, that this might be one of the fundamental secrets of American strength. It was a strength born not just of industrial might, but of a philosophy that valued the preservation of life and health. These conversations grew more open and reflective around the mess hall tables as they ate their rations of bread, potatoes, and canned meat. Some spoke with a sense of genuine shock, admitting that before their capture they had been taught to see Americans as monstrous, uncivilized beasts. Instead, they had discovered them to be, above all else, orderly, methodical, and relentlessly practical, even in something as mundane as the daily bath. Others took the observation a step further, suggesting that this focus on hygiene reflected an entire civilization built upon a foundation of abundance and efficiency, a society that had the luxury and the inclination to extend such fundamental practices even to its enemies. These ideas sparked heated, if quiet, debates. Not all prisoners were willing to concede such ground. Pride, nationalism, and the deep scars of indoctrination still ran deep. Many bristled at the suggestion that American civilization was in any way superior to their own. Yet the evidence was written on their own bodies, in their own improved health, in the clean smell of their clothes. It was undeniable. For some, this realization bred a new kind of bitterness. They muttered that this comfort was just another, more sophisticated form of warfare, designed to strip them of their martial spirit, to make them forget the virtues of endurance and sacrifice that defined the Japanese warrior. Others, however, felt something different stirring within them, a reluctant, grudging respect. They began to see the showers not merely as a place for washing, but as a window into the vast humming machine of American industry and the different, almost alien, philosophy of their captors. In hushed tones, a few of the more thoughtful men even admitted that the entire experience had fundamentally altered how they viewed the world beyond the barbed wire. It had forced them to question the propaganda they had been fed and to see their enemy not as a caricature, but as a complex, powerful, and disconcertingly organized society. Thus, the showers, once feared as potential instruments of torture and death, were transformed into centers of a quiet, personal revelation. They were no longer just about soap and water. They were about the stark, inescapable contrast between two worlds at war, and the dawning realization that their enemy's power was rooted not only in superior weapons and numbers, but in systems of living so advanced, so deeply embedded, that even prisoners of war were swept into the disciplined, hygienic orbit. It was a lesson in modern power, taught not with a fist, but with a bar of soap and a stream of hot water. Years later, when the war was a bitter memory and the surviving Japanese prisoners had long since returned to their homes, the memory of their captivity remained a complex and often painful tapestry, woven with threads of shame, relief, and profound confusion. Yet, among the countless impressions seared into their minds, the hunger, the loneliness, the stigma of surrender, one image persisted with startling and recurring clarity: the camp showers. Men who had fought in epic naval battles, who had survived the horror of island invasions and the despair of jungle campaigns, found that one of their most vivid and persistent memories was the sensation of hot water pouring from those metal pipes, the feel of the harsh soap foaming in the hands, the enforced daily rhythm of a cleanliness that had first unsettled them and then gradually transformed them. Some former prisoners spoke of it to their families after returning, awkwardly trying to describe the strangeness of it all, how the Americans had insisted on this daily ritual of hygiene. Their wives and mothers would listen in disbelief. How could the enemy, the ones who had bombed their cities and fought their sons, provide such care? Others chose to remain silent on the subject, reluctant to admit, even to themselves, that their time in captivity had, in this one specific way, offered a level of physical comfort that their own army, in its desperate, resource-starved state, had been unable to provide. Yet, in the privacy of their own thoughts, many acknowledged that the hygiene standards of the camp had irrevocably altered their perception of the world and of modernity itself. The memory of that endless, readily available hot water stood as irrefutable proof of a civilization that was different from their own, a civilization that was modern, abundant, and ruthlessly organized in ways that Japan, for all its discipline and deep traditions, had not been able to match. During the long, draining years of the war, the recollection was not sentimental. For the prisoners, the showers had been strange, humiliating, and frightening at first, but time and the undeniable benefits had reshaped those initial feelings. As diseases subsided, as wounds healed, as lice and fleas vanished from their lives, the association grew stronger and more positive in their minds. Cleanliness equaled health, and health was a form of strength. They came to understand that physical well-being was not a luxury for the weak, but a powerful silent weapon, one that America wielded with quiet, systematic efficiency. In later years, during reunions or in conversations with trusted comrades, some of the former prisoners admitted that this lesson was perhaps the most enduring one they brought back from the war, not a lesson about military tactics or strategy, but a lesson about the formidable power inherent in modern, organized living standards. Historians and researchers who later interviewed former prisoners from these camps often noted how frequently the subject of the showers appeared in their testimonies. Unlike food, which could be meager, or work details, which could be harsh and varied from camp to camp, the routine of enforced hygiene was nearly universal in American-run POW facilities. It left a psychological imprint that was, in many cases, deeper and more lasting than memories of hunger or forced labor. Men who had endured starvation in the field could reconcile themselves to meager camp rations. It was a continuation of hardship, an expected part of the prisoner's lot. But to be handed soap and a towel, to be marched into a room steaming with hot water, this was unforgettable precisely because it was so utterly alien to their entire wartime experience. It symbolized not mere indulgence, but an entirely different world view, a philosophy where the enemy, even in victory, recognized the captured soldier as a human being who must, as a matter of course, be kept clean and healthy. The long-term impact of this experience lingered quietly in the lives of these men. Some, once they had settled back into the rhythms of civilian life in a war-ravaged Japan, unconsciously maintained the habits they had learned in captivity. They washed more regularly and thoroughly, insisting on the use of soap even when it was still a scarce commodity in the post-war years. They taught their children that personal hygiene was a matter of discipline and self-respect, not a sign of weakness or vanity. For them, the camp showers had not been a mere routine to be forgotten. They had been a revelation, a concrete example of a different way of life, a lesson carried silently within them across the decades. In retrospect, the memory was always bittersweet. It was inextricably linked to the pain of defeat, the shame of surrender, the humiliation of being a captive. But it was also intertwined with the memory of survival, of an unexpected dignity discovered in the most unlikely of places, in the hands of an enemy they had been taught to despise with every fibre of their being. For many, this paradox came to define their entire war experience. It was the realization that in the very moment of their greatest humiliation, they had been granted an unexpected glimpse into a form of modernity, a different scale of human organization, and a different definition of strength that they could never entirely forget. The showers, in the end, were not simply about water and soap. They were about the discovery that even within the stark, dehumanizing structure of a prisoner of war camp, the simple, enforced acts of cleanliness, order, and care could alter the very way a man understood his own body, his enemy, and his place in a vastly changed world.